Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is the latest chapter in the long-running cinematic universe, so now it's time to start ranking all 32 MCU films from the worst to the best. Coming at last place at number 32 is Eternals. I will acknowledge the film itself looks gorgeous, it's got great cinematography, but the story and most of the characters are boring, and the film is melodramatic. It tries to have all these ideas about divine intervention, letting bad things happen, but it all comes off as very pretentious. The film, for some reason, is also told out of order, where we jump ahead to characters' deaths, but then a few scenes later we see them again. I acknowledge the ambition, but the execution is incredibly dull. Number 31, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. One of the biggest hot takes on my channel, but I thought this was an occultishly dark, graphically violent, and overly long film. When I go to an MCU movie, I'm expecting a fair bit of lightheartedness, but the majority of this film is just darkly occult, and this is coming from somebody who enjoys Harry Potter. I just left this movie with a very dark feeling. It felt too violent just for the shock value and for the sake of being violent, as opposed to being done tastefully. Number 30, The Incredible Hulk. Slow and boring, and on its own feels very out of place. The plot isn't that compelling, the film is dull. Apart from a few scenes that feel like a monster movie, this film is a slog. Number 29, Thor the Dark World. The movie's biggest problems are the first 20 minutes are a lot of exposition given to the audience at once, and the villain is boring. The only reason to even bother watching this movie is for the scenes with Loki and the death of Thor's mother, because it ties into Avengers Endgame. But this is for one that I think you can still justify skipping. Number 28, Captain Marvel. Much like Solo: A Star Wars Story or the Amazon Rings of Power show, this movie gives us answers to questions nobody was asking. The difference between this film and those, though, is that, at least with Solo and Rings of Power, they're enjoyable. It's hard to care about Carol Danvers as a character because she is already overpowered from the first scene, and it doesn't really feel like she grows or changes throughout the film. The film also feels like they just wanted to make another Guardians of the Galaxy type film, but without anything about that movie that made it fun. We need a quirky animal sidekick, so we're going to have Goose the Cat. We need retro music references, let's put it in the 90s. We need space battles. So given where the MCU was at this point in time, it feels much more like a Phase 1 movie and not a Phase 3 movie. It feels a bit of a step backwards. If this were released during Phase 1, fair enough, I'd probably be less harsh on it, but because it does feel like such step back, it is so low on the list. Number 27, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. It's a very mixed film for me. I appreciate the way this film pays tribute to the late Chadwick Boseman and deals with themes of grief. Out of the Phase 4 movies, this feels the most human. It feels the most personal. But when the film isn't honoring Chadwick Boseman, it gives too many plot lines. Besides the main plot line about Shuri dealing with the loss of her brother, there's also the plot line about Riri Williams, who, much like America Chavez in Multiverse of Madness, doesn't feel so much like a character, but rather a plot device. So much so, her last name might as well be MacGuffin. And by having her build an iron suit, it kind of negates Tony's sacrifice. What made Tony special was that he didn't have powers, but he was a tech genius. Such a tech genius that he's the only one able to build these suits. When anybody else tries to build them, they're just cruder versions. For example, Obadiah Stane in the first Iron Man film just takes leftover scraps from the suit Tony built to escape captivity, and he doesn't really know how to use it. When Justin Hammer tries it in Iron Man 2, the test pilots all get seriously injured, and again, his versions are just cheaper knockoffs. Even Spider-Man suits that he builds himself aren't that fancy. They're just a hoodie and some goggles. All of his fancier tech later on comes from Tony. And yes, in Far From Home, he does build himself a tech suit, but he does so with Tony's technology, and after having been mentored by Tony for a few years at that point. So they pretty much established that he's the only one who can build these. But now it expects us to buy into the idea that a teenage girl who, as far as we know, has never met Tony Stark in her life, can build her own iron suit. Making a machine that can detect vibranium under the ocean, that I can buy into, but being able to build a fully fledged iron suit, to me, is where it doesn't make sense. I get that she's smarter than average, but if we're at the point where anybody can build these things, you take away what made Tony Stark unique. When everyone's super, nobody is. And then there's also a very thin plotline about Martin Freeman's character I just didn't care about, and because the film is so somber and is dealing with some very serious themes, when there's humor inserted into the film, it feels unnaturally placed, awkward, and inappropriately timed. The film has a lot of emotion, but is very overstuffed. Speaking of which, 26, Iron Man 2. Another example of a film that had potential, but was ultimately in the end bogged down by its own ambition with too many plot lines. This feels like less of a story focusing on Tony, and more of a setup for the first Avengers film. And it seems like for every really good idea they had, they also counteracted it with a bad idea. Making Workers Whiplash, great villain, great idea. But then you have Justin Hammer, who is over the top and goofy and has incredibly stupid motivations. You have an interesting storyline about Tony Stark reactor poisoning him and how he's going to deal with that. But then the film also has scenes like Tony at a party peeing in his suit while he's drunk, and then getting into a weird fight with War Machine. It's like Marvel was so insecure about whether a sequel to Iron Man, which was already a huge gamble, would work. They basically said yes to every idea pitched, whether or not it made sense. Number 25, Thor. A film I don't really have that much to say about. I'm just kind of mixed on it. Kenneth Branagh brings his own unique style to the film, and there are some fun moments of Thor getting some culture shock with Earth, but there's nothing particularly ambitious about the film. It just feels like a typical comic book movie without anything about it that stands out apart from its cinematography. Number 24, Iron Man 3. It's a problem when the best part of the movie is not the main character. The best parts, in my opinion, about this film are the scenes with Harvey and the scenes with Trevor Slattery. Now, I know a lot of people aren't a fan of the Mandarin twist, but I think now, given the events of Shang-Chi, I think it makes sense. And even before Shang-Chi came out, I've always somewhat defended the twist. Captain America the Winter Soldier sets up the idea about evil people being implanted as the true villains while they use other people as pawns to take the fall. Now, personally, I think if they had released Winter Soldier first, it probably would have been better received. Number 23, Black Panther. It has a lot of great action and at times comes off like a spy film. Chadwick Boseman's charisma really makes the film work, but on a story level, I think that it has a few problems. The way a Wakandan society works doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. They don't choose their leaders based on their beliefs. They choose them based on who's the most brutal in combat. They're also so distrustful of each other that at the beginning of the film, when they're spies from Wakanda, they have also sent other spies to spy on their own spies. And at the end of the film, the people of Wakanda decide they're going to open the border to show the rest of the world a better way of living, even though they just had a war among their own people. And there's also that one other tribe that they just abandoned to live in the mountains and cut off contact with until it was convenient for them. Even though the action scenes are really fun and the film can have a lot of style at times, on a story level, it doesn't really work that much for me. Number 22, Doctor Strange. An MCU entry that, for me, it's enjoyable enough. The film does come off as a bit pretentious with its ideas about life, death, and other philosophical discussions that make it seem like it's trying to be the Matrix, and also combined with the visuals, while they are cool, are very reminiscent of Inception. The film does give the main character a great arc, which is why the other appearances of Doctor Strange, especially Multiverse of Madness, where they essentially made him the bad guy at the end of the film, so frustrating. On its own, it works as long as you ignore who he's in the other films, because in the other MCU films, he's really inconsistently written as to who he is. Number 21, Thor, Love, and Thunder. I get the criticisms with this film. If it was too goofy for you, okay. But for me, I think it worked enough. The film succeeded in one aspect where the first two Thor films didn't. I actually cared about the relationship between Thor and Jane. I do think Christian Bale was a cool villain, but they also did kind of waste his potential. I enjoyed the film when I saw it, but I'm not clamoring to watch it again anytime soon, though I don't think it's as bad as everyone says. 20, Thor Ragnarok. After Thor 1 was kind of middle of the road and Dark World was an absolute disaster, Taika Waititi finally brings us a Thor film that finally gets it right. The first two films had almost no sense of fun, and this film is a lot of fun, but it also does try to be Guardians of the Galaxy, and I do think that Grandmaster's villain didn't work. I think we should have spent more time with Hela because I do think she was a much stronger villain. Number 19, Avengers Age of Ultron. Much like how Iron Man 2 was the filler chapter to prep for the first Avengers movie in Phase 1, this is a filler chapter to prepare for Captain America Civil War. The cast, much like the first film, do still work well off each other, like the running joke about Captain America telling people to watch their language. And even the at the time newcomers, Elizabeth Olsen and Mary Taylor-Johnson, they give performances that feel like they've been there since the beginning of the franchise. They don't feel awkward because they're the new actors. James Spader gives one of my favorite villain performances in the MCU as Ultron. Say what you will about how they wrote the character, but his voice performance is chilling. The film does meander a bit in the second act, mostly again to set up Civil War, and the romance between Bruce and Natasha comes out of nowhere, and it also goes nowhere after this film, and it's not as high stakes or ambitious as the first Avengers, but I still find it kind of entertaining. Number 18, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Now, I really enjoyed this movie. I thought the Quantum Realm was very creative. I thought Catherine Newton worked well with Paul Rudd. Jonathan Majors steals the show as the villain Kang. But in terms of the tone, it's definitely the most serious of the three Ant-Man films. There is still some humor, but not nearly as much as its predecessors, so it's kind of an odd tone shift. Michael Pena and the other two comic relief characters from the previous two films aren't even in this one, and not even as cameos, which is a little bit disappointing, and I do think they wasted Bill Murray's potential in this film. They didn't really give him a lot to do. However, the film still has big grand spectacle, whereas the other two films were relatively small scale. It was still entertaining, but it definitely has a very different tone than the other two Ant-Man films. Number 17, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The biggest problem with this movie for me is that it has jokes in places where there don't need to be jokes. Like Wakanda Forever, there are scenes in this that are meant to help the audience connect with the characters, but instead of just simply pausing to let the audience sit, let the moment sit, they decide to just immediately follow it up with a joke. And what's also frustrating is the events that get the Guardians to meet Ego seem very contrived to me. They happen to land there because they get shot down because Rocket Raccoon stole batteries. Okay. A weird, contrived way to get them there, but okay. I do enjoy the character arc Star-Lord goes through, but some of the jokes need to be cut, and the first act could have been less contrived. Number 16, Ant-Man. Considering this was originally supposed to be a Phase 1 movie, but they couldn't agree on a script or director because Edgar Wright was supposed to originally direct this, and he's a little avant-garde. He didn't really fit with the tone of the MCU at the time. I think Edgar Wright could make a good MCU film now, but for Phase 1, he probably would have been a little bit out of place, so I do kind of agree with why. I do kind of understand why they got rid of him. So it sat for a bit, and so the film just kind of sat. That was kind of a bad sign. But I think this is one of those rare times where a film sitting in development for years actually worked to its advantage. There's a good chance that had it come out when it was supposed to, we may not have gotten Paul Rudd as the star. And I can't really imagine anyone else playing Scott Lang. Now, plot-wise, at least in terms of the villain, it is a little reminiscent of the first Iron Man film, but what gives it its own flavor is it's also a heist movie. And the main character is somebody who hasn't made the best decisions in life, and you want to see him turn his life around and succeed. The other films of Phase 2 were political thrillers or big spectacle sci-fi films. This is a film that feels more human and goes back to the simplicity of Phase 1. It's not my favorite film in Phase 2, but it's pretty close. Number 15, Iron Man. A film that, given all its ingredients, was a huge gamble. Films like X-Men The Last Stand, Fantastic Four, Superman Returns, and Spider-Man 3, those were not very well received by critics, and audiences were kind of mixed on those as well, and it cost many to believe that apart from Christopher Nolan's Batman films, only the first of which had been released at the time, the comic book film genre was more or less dead. Then, out of nowhere, a newly formed studio called Marvel Studios announced they're making a film about Iron Man, a character that, outside of the niche comic book community, nobody had really heard of. Sure, Iron Man had a cartoon in the 90s, but it wasn't as successful as the other comic book cartoons running at the time, such as X-Men or Batman. It only lasted for 26 episodes, as opposed to X-Men or Batman, which lasted for hundreds. On top of that, they announced that the character would be played by Robert Downey Jr., who at the time was an actor that nobody wanted to work with due to his substance abuse problems. And on top of that, Jon Favreau is announced as the director. Favreau had directed films before, but his only two relatively successful ones were Elf and Zathura. And even then, those were family films, not big action blockbusters with a lot of spectacle. By all accounts, this should not have worked. And yet, somehow it managed to have all the right ingredients to pull it off. Robert Downey Jr.'s charisma and comedic timing really helped the film, as well as its big, exciting action sequences. While other comic book movies at the time were a bit sillier, a bit more cartoonish, this one felt like it was taking itself seriously, and it was playing into real-world events that were happening at the time, such as the war in Iraq. Even though I don't like Iron Man that much as a character personally, I have to acknowledge it is a very well-made film. This is one of the only films from Phase 1 that still holds up, the other two for me being Captain America the First Avenger and The Avengers. Number 14, Ant-Man and the Wasp, a film that's even funnier than the first. It takes everything that worked about the first one and expands it. The story's better because it feels like it has its own unique flavor instead of just being a carbon copy of Iron Man 1. Scott Lang and Hope are a great duo in this one, and we also get more of the three wombats, who are one of the best parts of the film, and where they take their story in this film is also really fun. Number 13, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This is one of the most fun films in the MCU. The action is extremely well choreographed and fun to watch. The world building and mythology of the film are incredibly interesting, and like I said, it somewhat fixes the controversial Mandarin twist of Iron Man 3. But like I said, I never had a problem with that twist in the first place. What pushes it back a smidge is Awkwafina. She's very annoying and unfunny. The main character is so charming that to have Awkwafina be the comic relief and just have her be annoying really brings it down. And she's one of the most awkward parts of the film. Number 12, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The stakes for this movie are incredibly high, the characters all get satisfying arcs, and they all work extremely well off each other. And unlike a lot of MCU sequels that forgot what the previous film set up and doesn't follow through with them, such as Baron Mordo being set up as the villain for Doctor Strange, which they never followed through with, everything set up in the previous films comes back and feels important. The stakes of the plot revolve around Rocket Raccoon, and unlike a movie like Black Panther Wakanda Forever, where characters like Rhea Williams, again, felt like plot devices rather than actual characters, Rocket is an actual character in this film, not a MacGuffin. The way each character's arc ends is incredibly satisfying, and out of the three Guardians films, this is definitely the one with the most heart. I'd say it's almost perfect, but unfortunately what does hold it back a smidge is a pattern that I'm noticing with these films. Like I said, they are sometimes afraid to show too many negative emotions. There are some very dark moments in this film. And again, instead of letting the audience just feel the weight, they try to lighten things up with jokes, and they can feel a bit ill-timed at points. I know you want to lighten the tension, but like I keep saying, sometimes it's just more effective to let the audience feel something else. Another element that holds it back a bit is something that has been bogging down a lot of these Phase 4 projects. They expect you to have watched everything with these characters. So if you go into this movie not having watched the holiday special of Guardians of the Galaxy that's on Disney Plus that came out back in November, you're going to be a bit confused by the beginning. Because there are certain characters and plotlines from that special that come back and are important. We haven't watched it or watched it recently, and let's be honest, who's going to go back and watch a Christmas special in May? You're going to be a bit confused. However, apart from needing to watch the holiday special, this is a film that feels very focused on its own narrative. It isn't trying to set up the next 10 movies and shows. It feels like it stands as its own story. What they do with certain characters imply they could bring them back if they want to, but it doesn't feel like that's a priority. This feels like a movie made by a filmmaker, not by a studio. The other movies feel like they're trying to set everything up. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like a very personal project, not a studio product. It feels like a movie that was made the way the director wanted to make it, and not trying to compensate for 10,000 studio notes. And it's an incredibly satisfying emotional end to the Guardians trilogy. Number 11, Guardians of the Galaxy. A film that was very oddly marketed. The trailer didn't really show off any of the humor, so the whole idea of having a movie where two of the main characters are a raccoon and a tree, that seemed bananas. But much like Iron Man, it had just the right cast, just the right story, with well-written characters. The film serves as a redemption story with a very likable group of cast members who all work very well off each other. It's bizarre and it's out there, but it really works. And obviously it worked well enough that we now have a trilogy of these characters. Number 10, Black Widow. This, in my opinion, is how Brad Bird should have done Incredibles 2. Incredibles 2 was disappointing for me because instead of expanding on the ideas of the first film and having a movie about a crime-fighting family, it instead essentially became an Elastigirl spin-off movie, and with Jack Thor as filler. That is what I was hoping Incredibles 2 was going to be. Even though Brad Bird was not involved in this film, it feels like a lot of influence was taken from him, specifically with the first Incredibles movie and Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which is the one that he directed. The actors all have a very strong dynamic. The villain is one of the most despicable, non-superpowered MCU villains, right up there for me with Robert Redford's character in Winter Soldier. The action is well choreographed, the plot is intriguing, and even when the film slows down, the dialogue is also compelling, it keeps you invested, and I think it was worth the long wait. Number 9, Spider-Man Far From Home. Now, I liked this film a lot more when it first came out, but upon rewatching it, it's slightly deteriorated in quality for me. And that's to say I don't like it, I mean, it's in the top 10 on a list of over 30 movies. It's just that I do see a lot more issues with it now than when I first saw it. The film's biggest problem is that this movie is essentially Spider-Man cleaning up Tony's messes, even posthumously. So he's not really given a chance to be his own character until almost the end of the film. I think Jake Gyllenhaal was well cast as Mysterio, but his motivations, just like half the villains in the MCU, are hatred for Tony Stark. Peter doesn't even get his own villain to fight. He gets Iron Man's leftovers. A lot of the humor in this film also feels needlessly crass. Considering Spider-Man is still a teenager in this film, a lot of the raunchier jokes come off as really ewy. And I also don't think Zendaya has any chemistry with Peter, so to have a big part of the film revolve around Peter trying to get past his love for her just didn't work for me, since I don't really care about them as a couple. It's still a fun movie, but it's held back by its need to not let Tony Stark go. Number 8, Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man's first standalone entry to the MCU is a fun one. The film feels like a teen comedy from the 80s, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but with superhero elements thrown in. Tom Holland plays the unconfident, fresh to the superhero scene Spider-Man really well, but the film is also held back by, yes, its constant need to throw Iron Man in instead of just letting it be a solo Spider-Man film. Though, apart from the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, this does feel for the most part the most original source material. Number 7, Captain America, the First Avenger. Up to this point in the MCU, we had main characters who were genius scientists or gods. The main character in this one is neither of those things. He's just an ordinary guy who's trying his best to do the right thing despite the challenges he was born into, and even after getting his powers, he doesn't let it go to his head, as is so often the case with these stories. He remains true to who he was before the serum. He doesn't fight for fame or glory or wealth. He fights because he wants to defend the country and people he loves. Setting the film in World War II makes it stand out from the rest of the films in the MCU, as none of the other films really have that same style. It's got great action, a great script, and my personally favorite character in the MCU. Number 6, Captain America Civil War. This has one of my favorite fight sequences in the entire MCU with the airport battle. It's the cinematic equivalent of taking all your action figures and smashing them into each other. The film is well paced, and despite Cap's name being in the title, it doesn't show just his side of the conflict. It also presents Iron Man's point of view and lets the audience choose who they want to side with. Personally, I'm Team Cap. The film was also the introduction of Black Panther and Spider-Man. Black Panther in this film was really mysterious and cool, and of course, including Spider-Man after several years of rights negotiations with Sony, that blew our minds. There are two things about this film that I don't care for, however. First, being the issue of trying to make Captain America and Sharon a couple. The way they end Cap's story in Endgame, where he goes back to live with Peggy, now means that in that scene, he's kissing his niece. And even before we knew that, he only met her like one movie ago and knows so little about her that he didn't even know Sharon was related to Peggy until Peggy's funeral. So either way, it's weird. The Russo brothers also, they just need to pull a George Lucas and make an edit where he's not kissing her. They also wrote Endgame, so let this be a lesson in going back and reading what you previously wrote. The other issue is Spider-Man's intro scene. Aunt May just lets Tony Stark, this adult stranger, be alone with her teenage nephew, where Stark then proceeds to lock the door and tell Peter to lie to May about where he's going with him without her supervision and what he's doing. She's not a good guardian. It's an almost perfect film, but it feels a bit short because of those issues. Number 5, Captain America the Winter Soldier. This movie is actually perfect. Even honest trailers couldn't make fun of it. It's arguably the most accessible MCU movie, as it doesn't feel like a comic book movie at all. It's more of a Tom Clancy-esque political thriller. The action is well done, the story is intriguing, Cap and Black Widow have great chemistry, which makes me mad that they never ended up together. The villain is one of the best non-superpowered villains in the MCU with an absolutely despicable plan. This is one of my favorite non-Avengers MCU films. Number 4, The Avengers. Well, maybe now, by today's standards in the MCU, it's not quite as ambitious as the other Avengers films because we have come such a long way since it came out. It's still really good. Even though story-wise it's a bit smaller scale and maybe the villains are kind of generic, the cast and writing are what carry the film. The cast is very entertaining with their quick back and forth with each other. The panorama shots in this film that show all of them are well directed by the cinematographer, and it's still a fun ride even all these years later. Number 3, Avengers Endgame. An almost perfect finale to over 20 films of build-up. There's really only one issue I have with the film. Like I keep saying, is that they have Cap go back to live with Peggy instead of having him choose Black Widow. Because even before she dies, there's nice little scenes of them just talking, and they do really have good chemistry. Thor also gets a bit of closure to some of the more traumatic events in his life, which is nice. This is almost everything I'd want from a film of this nature. It works really well, even if it's not quite perfect. Number 2, Avengers Infinity War. A film with such a big cast and over 20 films to build up, there was a huge risk of it being overstuffed. But, by some miracle, it works. All the actors keep up with each other incredibly well, the film has one of the darkest openings in the MCU, and Thanos is one of the greatest villains in cinematic history, up there with the likes of Darth Vader. They make him complex, and even though you don't agree with what he's doing, or at least I hope you don't, you understand why. It's got big spectacle, a compelling story, and one of the best twist endings of cinema history. And coming at number 1 is my personal favorite MCU film is Spider-Man No Way Home. Now some of you are probably thinking, you're just blinded by the nostalgia. You only like this film because of its novelty. And while to some degree that is true, taking the nostalgia factor out of it, this film works because of its characters and how the arcs are resolved. Tobey's Spider-Man gets to be the cool older mentor to the other two Spideys, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man finally gets closure over Gwen Stacy's death, and by the end of the film, Tom Holland's Spider-Man has grown as a character the most than he has in the other films. The other two films, he was thought of as the successor to Tony Stark. But at the end of this film, he is his own person. He gets a fresh reset. He gets a chance to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man he's always wanted to be. He's learned how to control his anger and grief and how to be responsible with his powers. For some, this may be nothing more than a novelty film, but for me, I think it's a film that brings one of the best closures to a character in the MCU, and it comes in at number 1. It's going to share ranking of the MCU films, and I will see you next time.